It is antithetical to the British common law upon which our system of justice was based. It's as if you would have a Soviet court rendering that sort of a decision. I'm sorry, Soviet, Russian, whatever. But even before Sotomayor was confirmed, we had the Supreme Court decision in the Kelo case that said the government could take one person's private property and give it to another, not for the purposes of the state, but for the purposes, the private commercial purposes of one versus another. The Kelo decision, just like Roe, was an act of judicial tyranny. Eminent domain was supposed to be, under the Constitution, limited to takings for public purpose, not for the power of giving the government the right to choose between farms and shopping centers. It really was a decision worthy of King George. And it was a major blow to our ability to prosper because, like so many other actions of government, it was an invasion of our personal economic freedoms. The one thing that I think few people reflect on is what's in Hernando de Soto's great book. He's a Venezuelan economist, and he wrote Why Capitalism Works in the West and Nowhere Else. And he basically says there that the reason why capitalism works in the West is that we have a system of stable laws that are enforceable, that protect property rights. You can't transfer property. If I were living, heaven forbid, in Caracas, and I wanted to sell my home to someone who came in, I couldn't really be sure of the title because I wouldn't know what the government would be saying about the title the following day. That's the point. If you have stable laws, which we used to have, you have economic freedom and you have the ability to prosper. If you're not economically free, you're not free. Think of our rising national debt. It will reduce the standard of living of our children and our grandchildren. I don't want to have to tell my sons, but I have told them, you're not going to likely be able to have as nice a house as your mom and I do. You're probably not going to drive that 500 horsepower Mustang of mine, but because you're not going to be able to afford it. Our currency is being devalued, your future is being devalued, and frankly, I don't know what we can do about that portion of the problem. The Heritage Foundation has written in the invaluable Index of Economic Freedom that America's economic freedom has been measurably diminished by the actions of the executive branch. We have banks and car manufacturers nationalized. We've really lost so much of our economic freedom now, we're shrugging it off. But other attacks keep coming at us, our system of government, from this group of people, this unrepresentative government, which we now have in place. Last year, the Justice Department dropped the case against the new Black Panther Party for voter intimidation. We all saw the videotape. Everybody here saw it on Fox, where there was no reasonable doubt about the intent or the effect of the people who were walking around in front of that Philadelphia voting booth, voting station, with clubs in their hands. We know what their intent was. We know what the likely effect was. It is a tyranny, ladies and gentlemen, and not a petty tyranny when the federal government chooses to not protect the right to vote. We have had an awful lot of people fight and die to protect that right. How dare they? How dare they not protect our right to vote? Last week, well, a federal court ruled that the individual mandate in Obamacare was constitutional, and other courts, I'm sure, will have their opportunity to have a say in that. But where will this erosion end? Government derives its legitimate powers from the consent of the governed. This government no longer can claim that consent. Think about the summer of 2009. What an amazing spectacle it was. The birth of the Tea Party movement, tens of thousands of people marching, going to town hall meetings of their congressmen and senators, calling out for their representatives and their senators to not vote for Obamacare. It was so great an outcry that the Democrats literally had to bribe their own members in order to get the doggone thing passed. Remember the Cornhusker kickback, the second Louisiana Purchase? It was amazing. They passed it anyway, and over the strong objections of the American voter. This is not the act of a representative government. The health care bill and so many others are the fuel that keeps the tea parties burning. If you can be required to buy health insurance, why can't you be required to buy a Chevy Volt from Government Motors? A lot of people have made that analogy, and it's not funny. We have to think about these things. These cases, and so many others, point to the failure, point to our failure as a nation to value the freedoms we have and to take the risks that are necessary to defend them. Americans haven't demanded that Congress act to restore the many freedoms that have been taken piecemeal, and so our government has become, in some ways, a tyranny, not personified in a king. It is but the sum of many tyrannies, petty and otherwise, which we have allowed and even demanded that our government perform. In this book, John Armour wrote, "Tyrannies are always disguised in show and pageant. They are defended with slogans. The tyrant is deified. Otherwise, the truth will bring them down. The cult of personality was not an accident in the Soviet Union and China or in many other nations. It is always a necessary ingredient of tyranny." And let me tell you what other tyrannies we have had. One of the things that has bothered me so much as a journalist, and in talking to many of my friends on Capitol Hill, good people, men and women who have worked so hard to do their job as legislators. I know one gentleman, I won't mention his name, but he literally went for about 2 months without sleep, just trying to read this stuff. When a 2,000-page bill is introduced at 11 o'clock at night, and you've got to vote on it at 10 o'clock the following morning, that's a tyrannic act. When it is followed by another and still another, our congressional process fails. When you can't read a bill before you vote on it, how can you try to write amendments to it to try to fix the problems it poses? How can you go around to your colleagues and create groups and caucuses to fight against it? How can you go to the American people and go on the media, go on Alan's show and say, how do we beat this thing? You can't. The process fails. The angry liberalism that has consumed Congress is another form of tyranny, and it has, in fact, reduced our legislature to sort of a banana republic. Is there a solution to all of this? Perhaps. Perhaps it is found in John Armour's book, but I fear, and I use that word infrequently, I fear we may have missed the time in which we can apply the solution. In the introduction to his book, John Armour wrote, "Others claimed independence for America. Others fought for its war and independence. Others created its government and served in it. But it was Paine who turned mere colonists into Americans, into citizens of a new nation." End quote. Think about that. That is very literally true. Americans had no real national identity before Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. And people read that. Everyone, literally, about 1/3 of the Americans, as we know from John Armour's book, about 1/3 of Americans at that point were literate. Virtually every single one of them read Common Sense. And the ones who couldn't read heard it read aloud in pubs and taverns and everywhere else, in churches. It probably was as well read as the Bible in those days. And that is a powerful, powerful thing. If only we could get everyone to read it today. But I fear we may not. But what have we lost? What are we talking about here? This national identity. My friend Herb London, who's the president of the Hudson Institute in New York, is I think, well, you want to talk about a genius, that's a genius. He is probably one of the leading conservative thinkers of our day. He wrote in his great book, America's Secular Challenge, and I quote, well, before I get to the quote, he was talking about what Paine created for Americans. It's really a version of what in Roman times was called civitas. And Herb in his book said, quote, "Civitas by another name is patriotism, a selfless devotion to one's society and the citizens who constitute it." And as he notes in his book, Harvard sociologist Daniel Bell wrote that civitas was, quote, "the spontaneous willingness to obey the law, to respect the rights of others, to forego enrichment at the expense of the public weal," end quote. This is what America largely has lost. We have reached a point where it may very well not be recoverable. This year, about 53 million Americans will receive Social Security benefits totaling $703 billion. 41.8 million people will receive food stamps. And perhaps most troubling of all, 47% will pay no taxes. We are at the point very soon where the taxpayers will be outnumbered by the tax eaters. At that point, democracy fails. People who pay no taxes, who do not serve in the military, who do not produce by the sweat of their brow something of value to society, can still vote. But those people and the multitude of immigrants who do not assimilate into our society cannot be expected to defend the freedoms our Constitution guarantees. The quality of civitas is not in their character, and they have no motive to achieve it. Civitas, patriotism, is not a hollow concept, and it can't be created spontaneously, nor can it be taught easily. It must be taught in the classroom, and not just by saluting the flag. I hope, some states will take John Armour's book and literally make it the American history curriculum for a semester. It also must be taught, though, by every parent to every child, teaching him how grateful they should be for the privilege of being an American. The patriotism we must teach is not just saluting the flag or expressing support for those who are going harm's way. It is much more. Patriotism requires personal sacrifice by each person who claims it as an attribute. That is the patriotism we must now demand of our leaders and ourselves. We must demand of them the personal and political courage to risk their political futures, to end the tyrannies we now endure, to reverse what has been done to our Constitution and to our economy in just the past 2 years and more. That courage is of an odd sort. It's something which has to be found deeply inside a person. I think it is best described by Civil War historian Shelby Foote. Shelby Foote called it 4 o'clock in the morning courage. He wrote, and I quote, "Grant, the general, had many qualities, but he had a thing that's very necessary for a great general. He had what they call 4 o'clock in the morning courage. You could wake him up at 4 o'clock in the morning and tell him the rebels had just turned his right flank, and he would be as cool as a cucumber. Grant, after that first night in the wilderness, went into his tent, broke down, and cried very hard. Some of his staff members said they'd never seen a man so unstrung. Well, he didn't cry until after the battle was over, and he wasn't crying when it began again the next day. It just shows the tension that he lived with without letting it affect him." In about 3 weeks, Americans will go to the polls in what must be regarded as a referendum on our unrepresentative government. In the Revolutionary period, as Armour writes, and as I mentioned before, about 1/3 of Americans were literate, and all of them read Common Sense. Those who weren't able to read it heard it elsewhere. And we can't expect everybody to read it in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But in the next 2 or 3 years, the next 2 years specifically, between now and the 2012 presidential election, Armour and Paine should be read by every American. I know it's customary to begin a speech with a joke and end it by leaving the audience with a soaring good feeling of what's facing them the next day. But I seek no political office, and having failed to begin with the first custom, I can continue to violate the second. These are, again, the times that try men's souls. A little over 40 years ago, I took an oath to protect this country and defend its Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic, even to the risk of my life. I've never served in combat, and I claim no personal heroism. But I do claim that I am still bound by that oath, and I challenge each and every one of you to join me in being faithful to it. Each of us has a role to speak and to act, to help restore America's civitas, our selfless devotion to American society and the citizens who constitute it. It's time for us to reach deeply and bring that 4 o'clock in the morning courage forth. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.